Sure, it'll be entirely worth it. So we'll go in the order that's on the program. So we'll start with Uttara, then go to Katharine, and then Aasim and Gaurav. And each of the presenters will have about 15 minutes, and we'll take questions right at the end. So unless there's sort of burning kind of clarificatory questions, I'll just ask you all to hold all questions till the end.
Interested in the language and the grammar of policy itself. So this is the analysis of this mission. So in a speech delivered at the Global Conference on Cyberspace in November 2017, Prime Minister Modi said, "We are using the digital domain to facilitate participative governance or Jan Bhagidari, strengthen the smart city mission and the cities that it seeks to build." So in answering these questions, we will also talk about whether the introduction of technology automatically strengthens governance and democracy. And it's a fairly fundamental question because information and communication technology in particular has the reputation of being what is known as a horizontally networked space. So horizontal networks are thought to be of transparent, equally accessible to all, and e-governance, which is the use of ICT in governance, is thought to be more democratic than traditional forms of governance because it exists in this horizontally networked space. And this also relates quite closely to the general idea of the city, which is thought to be of an anonymous, open, accessible, more democratic space when we compare it to rural areas. But this idea of a horizontally networked space as being open is, it's not necessarily true because these e-governance platforms, for example, might overlook factors of literacy, language, age, place, gender. So in one of the first presentations at this conference, there was the talk of the digital divide and the haves, and not just the have-nots, but the have-lesses. So the core argument of this paper is that technology is a tool that must be governed and tailored to its best use rather than implemented without modification or critique. And as is true for any other instrument or policy solution, technology must also be contextualized. So in other words, we need to govern technology before we use technology to govern. And within this paper, we will be looking at the intersection of technology, the city, and governance under the Smart City mission. And the final aim is to make certain policy recommendations in the hope of improving, maybe potentially improving the mission, as well as the cities that it seeks to build in terms of making cities actually open for and better for the majority of the population. So just in terms of, just a quick aside that within this paper, I am looking at technology to mean only information and communications technology or digital technology, which is any product that will store, retrieve, manipulate, transmit, or receive information electronically. And also I'm looking at the pillar of governance within the Smart City mission, although it has other aspects to it, of course. And ICT is increasingly being used in governance. It is being used to gauge public opinion, to surveil citizens, to even study behavior patterns and collect data. And therefore, there is a need to have a discussion on whether technology itself needs to be governed. So quickly, a little bit about smart cities and what a smart city is. I'll just run through this and also the mission quite quickly. So there's no binding definition of what a smart city is. It's a pretty open-ended kind of definition. It did originate within IT companies and in the private sector. So the conceptualization of the smart city came mostly from IBM and also from Siemens. There are a few factors that do define smart cities. So the widespread use of modern technologies and primarily digital technologies is one of them. According to certain theorists, the use and collection and analysis of data, or the real-time city of being able to continuously read a city and the network of cities, is also an important factor to be classified as a smart city. Originally, smart cities were thought of more as greenfield cities that would be built from the ground up. These have largely remained plans on paper. Much more common are smart solutions or cities being endowed to existing cities. And India's smart city mission pretty much exists within this field of applying smart solutions to existing urban areas. So the Smart City mission in India, which was launched in 2015 by the Ministry of Urban Development, follows the same not too rigid definition of what a smart city is. So it says that it means different things to different people, and it can vary from city to city, from country to country, depending on the willingness to change what the aspirations of the city's population is, and what, so the mission itself allows for urban local bodies, or ULBs, the city level government, as well as state governments. It gives them a lot of leeway to determine for them what a smart city means, what they want to, the kind of policies they want to apply under this mission. So just a few, so the Ministry of Urban Development identified 100 cities. There was at least one city from each state or union territory, and most of these cities are kind of proportionally related to population and urban size, both within the state and in terms of the country. The mission itself, so it calls itself guidelines, and that's what it is. It's not, it is a policy document and it's not a policy document, which is what makes it so interesting, because it's constantly talking about how urban local bodies are given the freedom to determine what comes under their purview of smartness, but it does have certain more stringent guidelines. Again, these are not compulsory, so it talks about certain core infrastructure elements that smart cities should have, and certain features, certain solutions. But these core principles, I think, are very important, especially in our discussion of sustainability, inclusive development, and the developing of the entire urban system, the urban ecosystem. So these are the mission's core principles, and they do mention it on and off. They don't go into much more depth about what sustainability is, what inclusive development is, or what the, well, they talk about the urban ecosystem a little bit, but the first two principles are just mentioned as core principles, but left at that. So in terms of so basically each of these 100 cities had to send in a proposal. The best cities were then chosen for the first round, the first 20, the others were made to continue to work on their proposals and then come back. And after a proposal has been accepted, then cities are to set up what are called special purpose vehicles. So these are not part of the urban local body. They are set up as separate companies, and private entities can buy stake in this company and work with both the ULBs as well as state governments on taking forth these smart city proposals. So these SPVs basically are there to implement and take forth the vision that is in these proposals. So now to the crux of my paper, which is the connections between technology and governance. So like I talked about the entire urban ecosystem, there are 4 pillars that the smart city mission chalks out, and the governance infrastructure is one of them. And technology and governance within the mission play an important role on how technology will strengthen governance. So technology has been a boon to the masses. It has helped with the dissemination of information. It has given the marginalized a voice. In a very interesting essay titled Democratizing the Digital, Jack Schenker writes, digital technologies are changing politics as we know it, but not because of some inherent or immutable characteristic that stands apart from the world in which they were created. Instead, these technologies have helped an underlying condition, namely growing discontent at marketization to find meaningful expression in the formal political arena. And here about finding expression for whatever the discontent is in the formal political arena is what the boon of technology has been. On the other hand, technologies have also been used to increase control and maintain the status quo. And so other theorists who also talk a lot about smart cities, Clark and Shelton, write that the building of smart cities could mean the perpetuation of long-standing patterns of geographically uneven development. So the blind application of ICT to public policy and governance could lead to control over public goods and services by the private sector, or draconian control by government over its own citizens. And even if we want to go to such an extreme of this kind of post-apocalyptic world, technologies have their own sets of vulnerabilities, and if these vulnerabilities are not addressed, that could leave citizens and governments dangerously exposed. And the pervasiveness of the NSA in the United States, the cyber attacks by Russia on Estonia in as early as 2007 are examples. And more fundamentally, technology cannot lead to or deepen democracy, if the technology in question is not itself democratic and transparent. And the growing debacle around Aadhaar is a really good example of this. And it's not necessary that something is really wrong. Maybe things are functioning well, but perception of the use of this technology and the kind of control and exposure that the government has also plays an important role. So the application of technology in such a regime makes governance seem as an act that is apolitical. So this is reflected in the very idea of the smart city. And Rob Kitchen writes, and I quote, "Smart city advocates imagine themselves as creating technologies, techniques, and visions that are scientific, objective, commonsensical, and apolitical." Sorry. So governance is a service that is to be delivered with promptness and efficiency, and if technology can help bring that about, then it is an asset to governance. So in this approach, technology itself is seen as a tool that is apolitical and one that does not need to be scrutinized. It is one that's unbiased. This is a notion that's debatable in itself, but even if we were to assume that technology is indeed apolitical and unbiased, that is not the purpose of policy. The purpose of policy is to be transformative and is to work in interest of the public. So I'm going to skip a little bit ahead because we're running short of time. But one of the ways to understand where technology is in terms of a balance between the technical and the social, which is another aspect, and too much of technocentrism could lead to a technocracy, and we could talk about that maybe more in the Q&A. But so under the smart city mission, the private sector has a great deal in terms of how much of its expertise is sought by the mission itself, much more than other stakeholders, advocacy groups, NGOs, grassroots level organizations, people have in terms of the say that they have in the smart city mission. And so the smart city mission does talk a lot about smart solutions. It talks about IT connectivity and digitization. It talks about making governance citizenship friendly, but it does not talk about the need to institute checks and balances in these systems of e-governance. It does not talk about ULBs needing to ensure that the rights of citizens and their privacy is not hindered with. It does not talk about digital literacy. It does not talk about bridging the gap of digital literacy. These are not things that the mission espouses. And this could either be because the mission mistakenly assumes that digital spaces are horizontal, or it could be because it is disinclined to actually open governance up to more marginalized and diverse voices. And both these scenarios are equally dangerous. So coming a little bit to policy recommendations. Again, I'm just going to rush through this because we don't have much time. There are, again, a lot of good things that this policy has, and this is an important policy. We need urban policy to govern our urban spaces better. So the argument is not against the smart city mission itself. The argument is for the governing of technology and the strengthening of the mission. So to begin with, there needs to be greater structural reform of urban local bodies before e-governance is just rolled out without any thought, because this could lead to an increased involvement of the private sector without adequate checks and balances. Rather than concentrating so much on competition, there should be a concentration on collaboration between cities and technology can play an important role in this, in sharing information, in sharing experiences, and like I talked about, a cross-section of expertise rather than only gaining expertise from the private sector. And so those are the main things, and apart from that, the transparency and accountability are finally what it comes down to. And if building a smart city means the constant collection of data and information, there must be a clear understanding of what data is being collected, by whom, to what end, and who might have access to this data. Technology must be used to make government itself more transparent rather than just for governance. And as a conclusion, technology can help to improve infrastructure, systems, and the delivery of governance. However, technology can also become to viewed dangerously as a panacea for the failures of government, or as a silver bullet that will solve everything and make democracy flourish. Neither of this is true. So Jack Schenker, again, a very nice quote in that same essay, writes, "Yet to date, we have acquiesced in the construction of a far larger digital metropolis in which the notion of public accountability is assumed almost by default to be inapplicable. This should not be our reality. The digital world can and should be held publicly accountable, and the Smart City mission should strive to do just that. The success of any policy finally can be measured only by the lives it improves and the democratic systems it strengthens. In order to be a successful policy, the Smart City mission must first bolster its political will and ask itself who it is building these smart cities for and who has a right to these cities, after which it can apply this will to increasing the use of technology.
Well, first of all, thank you, Uttara, because I think there's a really nice panel, really nice way that sets up some of the things which hopefully I can look at. My name's Katharine Willis from Plymouth University from the UK. I've been involved with led a research network, which is a knowledge exchange network funded by the UK Research Council, looking at smart cities, but looking at it very much through the lens that Uttara has sort of introduced, this idea of participation and governance and who's right to the city. The motivation for this was really some work we did looking at some smart cities projects in both Europe and Brazil, and identifying a massive lack in the same way that was mentioned of who's involved and how they're involved. So to sort of set up a little bit of framing to how we approached this topic, we've been thinking through this idea of this Lefebvrean approach to the idea of the right to the city, and what that implies in terms of participation, to try and give some sort of way to interrogate what participation might mean in the smart city. And Lefebvre sort of very much talks about participation as a right, as a way in which people can become involved in the urban space. And it's different from a right as in a sort of property right. It's a right to access and a right to, in a sense, quite a playful or creative way to participate in the city. And interestingly, in our work with Brazil, the right to the city is enshrined within the Brazilian constitution, and it's part of their approach. Whether it's adhered to is another matter, but this sort of in-depth thinking about what the right to the city might constitute. It's this idea to fully enjoy urban life, the right to habitation, as well as taking direct part in the management of cities. So this very much includes this idea of participation. So to have the right to the city, you have to have certain rights to participation. And as a result of that, what we saw from looking at a sort of series of global smart city projects was there were some fundamental issues with what participation meant in the smart city, which I think Uttara sort of highlighted. But because of this top-down, technocentric approach, one, participation was sort of seen as some sort of given through the digital, which of course is fundamentally flawed. But what we also find was a really worrying trend is that it not only highlighted digital exclusion rather than digital inclusion, but it also reinforced marginalisation of certain groups. So while they might be pitched as emancipatory and progressive and development-led, what we saw was that certain groups were becoming less included in the city as a result of smart city projects. So there's a certain privileged elite who might benefit and who are expected to benefit, but not only are some groups, marginalised groups, particularly those from informal settlements or in the informal economy, not included, but they're actually being literally, physically, digitally and sort of socially excluded from these projects. So there's a sort of serious societal challenge around what the aims are. So as part of this, we had a network which links up an Indian partner in Chennai, so the Civic Consumer and Action Group, which is an activist organisation working on a range of civic issues, and some academics from the UK and Brazil. And we had a workshop in Chennai in 2016, which was an initial intent to look at a smart city project that's being delivered through the Indian Smart City Mission, see what's proposed through it, so a little bit similar to the methodology that Uttara talked about, but also to go into the urban space into which the smart city is proposed, look at what was there and look at what marginalised groups or what marginalised aspects of the urban space might be affected by those smart city projects. So we had a visit to the area of Chennai, which won the Smart City Mission project of T. Nagar. We did some mapping activity of the actual reality of the urban space. We also had a discussion with a series of stakeholders, both within the space, but also in a workshop session. So we had some activist organisations and some local academics who sort of hopefully brought us some local insights or insights from who the stakeholders might be within these marginalised groups. I don't need to do this because you've already done it. So the Indian Smart City Mission. This is the Tinagar, so Chennai, obviously the whole urban area. So the Smart City Mission projects are pitched as a whole city project with a component of a neighbourhood in which you deliver the main core of your work. So the neighbourhood chosen was an interesting one in Chennai. It's the busiest shopping district, so it's actually a very lively. It's not digital in any way intentionally. It's a very, very busy urban shopping district, the central shopping district of Chennai. This is the lovely little checklist that you get to produce a Smart City Mission to prove that you're going to deliver all these aspects of urban development. So the components of water, waste, power, traffic, ICTs, and as Uttara mentioned, the SPV business model. So although it might in label be smart cities, it's essentially an urban regeneration project, which, as we found from some academics from RV College, so Bindu Sastry talked about some of her work with the RNJM. I got the right acronym. The JNURM. Sorry, I get the acronym wrong. JNURM Urban Regeneration Project. It's a sort of a repackaged JNURM called Smart and with a lot of rhetoric. So what did participation mean in the Smart City project? So this is the text from the Chennai documents. Obviously these were original documents, so this was back from 2016. Essentially participation seemed to mean an online forum with some sort of basic e-participation, which if anybody's worked in consultation around urban regeneration projects, that's not sufficient to get any form of participation in large-scale urban infrastructure projects. You don't have any idea of really how that might impact on certain groups. If you're not working with key stakeholders, if you're working with sort of individuals sort of saying yes or no to some sort of rather oversimplistic statements, you're not going to get any sort of buy-in or understanding of what the local problems are. And interestingly, not much later in the document, this is how they assign stakeholder roles. So I don't think we see citizens anywhere in that. And actually the main participants, stakeholders in smart city projects are the city governments and vendors, private partnerships, because private businesses intended to deliver these projects. So just to give an example of when we went into the urban space, so we did some mapping of looking at what was proposed in the space, and I won't go into the details, but essentially there's a whole range of very fairly high level, very technical solution-based approach to urban problems. So implementing sensors in various aspects of the space to control flooding, to control waste management, to control traffic. So traffic management based on some sort of app. So there's this sort of techno solution-based approach. And I come from a very positivistic view of technology. So, but I don't, it's well known that these things need to be implemented in a very sensitive. They need to understand the local context, and they need to be implemented in a sort of very, very site-specific way, and these are very general approaches. They seem to be, a lot of the time, recycled, failed projects from technology companies that haven't managed to sell them somewhere else and have repackaged them and sold them. So waste management is a really interesting example. There was this quite extraordinary, and it is a sort of an inherently smart city technology to use RFID or smart sensors on a range, so using Internet of Things as a way implemented on the waste bin network around that area of Chennai. The idea was that once a bin was full, the sensor would give a notification to a central system. The central system would then activate to move that waste bin to empty the waste. So it's an automation of a waste management system. And then linking that back to some sort of recycling concept. Generally, although the sensors might be cheap, that sort of infrastructure is fairly complex. It's not really been implemented at that wider level in a lot of cities, so it's a big aspiration to do. And what we felt when we looked at the space and how waste is managed in an urban context, one, it's the move to a entirely technical solution seems inappropriate. 2, waste is managed by people. So the need to think about technological and the people. So this pretty much excludes any sort of local management of waste. It's a centralisation of the system. And if we look at how waste is managed in an Indian street context, it's managed quite locally and quite individually. There's an ownership of the space around waste. And waste is mixed up with a whole set of other processes too. So, is that the right is that the right solution to a sort of and potentially the benefits of using RFID or using some sort of sensor-based network might be useful, but is that the most appropriate solution, and can it be implemented? And that pretty much maps across the other aspects, so the other areas. So traffic management, again, if we look at how traffic was managed in that space, it's very dense. There's a whole mixture of different types of transport, all within the same space, all sort of operating on much more local understandings of how the space works. So moving it to some sort of city-level traffic management system is really complex and probably not achievable. So smart parking, for example, is that how do we achieve that? And then, I don't know if I can get this to play. And then when we did some very simplistic sort of ethnographic work by asking people, what is a smart city? And interestingly, people had an answer, but it was a different answer every time. And it was very much based on what sounded like the rhetoric of the government, which was smart cities good, and it's about development, and we want it. What is it? Oh, it's solar panels, or it's development. So it was, there's an awareness, there's been an awareness raising, but it's based on an aspiration to some sort of slightly utopian future, which is not maybe that realistic, and to not buy into it would be somehow not progressive. So I think that sort of cynicism, thinking around technologies in a much more sort of how does it work for me, wasn't necessarily there. I don't know if I can get this. I can't get the display. And then, as part of this idea of who's included and who's excluded, we had some participants in the workshop from the Indian Street Hawkers Association, so the leader of the Indian Street Hawkers Association. And they see that this is as massively problematic, and initially we couldn't quite understand, but basically what the Smart City mission involves is a sanitisation of the urban space and a moving of the street hawkers out of the space into a market externally. So for them, they lose their livelihoods. So this essentially sort of highlights this idea of what groups are included, and those groups who occupy the space, whose livelihoods are there, and are obviously, the rationale to move them has been led through other ways, but this becomes an urban cleansing program rather than an urban development program. So they had this slogan of, we want bread, not smart city. And they weren't against smart cities as such, but the way it's been implemented, which basically said that as part of a sort of smart city approach, which sort of, I think, unfortunately has a sort of Western model of the clean, sort of sanitized street space, and there may be problems with how street hawkers work in the space, but they're really, they're as part of T Nagar, which is, very obviously a busy urban shopping space. The street hawkers were part of that space, and if they move, they will lose their livelihoods. So we were thinking through, how might we interrogate the right to participation or the right to participation in the smart city, and we're looking at some sort of categories of what participation might mean. And essentially, a lot of the time finding that they weren't there. So citizens do not have the right to the city in the smart city. So if you look at an ability to participate, citizens and community groups are not seen as stakeholders. As part of the right to participation, it's important to recognise who inhabits the city. And we're seeing the people who inhabit the space, informal street traders, the people operating informal parking mechanisms, that the space of the street and how it's managed, those people were not included, and actually they are to be excluded. Sort of recognising or enabling power relations which are horizontal in a way. Fundamentally, the SPV business model, which is a privatisation of public services, means that the power is with the city and private business, and actually it's about moving power structures to a privatisation of those sort of urban services for monetisation, which is itself very, very problematic. And then if we look at capacity, because a lot of the way the smart city mission is envisaged is entirely infrastructural, and quite large-scale infrastructure with large-scale budgets. They're difficult to implement. And a lot of infrastructural projects, if we look at them, are not necessarily participatory in nature, because how can I know a road that takes me from here to there? How do I participate in part of that belongs to me or is part of my space? So not only does infrastructural projects sort of, in a sense, deny some sort of local access, but we found also, and in fact, what we found as one of the key outcomes of doing this project was the need to inform people about smart city projects and the fact that there was really a lack of actual realistic information. If you actually got down to the nitty-gritty of what was happening, that was very, very rarely disseminated. So it was a lot of the vision, the reality was quite hard to get at, and actually raising awareness and sort of, in a sense, providing awareness raising as part of what a smart city project was seemed to be really important to enable participation. So essentially all those things on the right-hand side of that table are not really present, which is worrying. So again, and not surprisingly, I've come back and found that in January the 9th, 2018, it's essentially a sort of fairly failed project. And I think you probably could have said that back in 2016. I'm just going to, okay, well, I'll just briefly run through. We did look at some ways in which it is done in a positive way. So right to the smart city, we need the capacity of marginalised group to be smart, and we think they are. There are lots of examples of smartness that are not called smart, and we need to reclaim those, taking into account the informality of the city they inhabit, the recognition of power asymmetries, looking at accessible infrastructures. So in a Lefebvrean sense, he sees those as sort of playful, temporal and imaginative, and the ability for self-management or ownership, so governance, based on scales of visibility. So we often found that marginalised groups do not want to be overtly visible. They want to claim data for themselves, and how do you manage that? And another aspect we found is that the complete lack of capacity within cities to deliver smart city projects in terms of who's working on them. So as part of that, one of the things we've been doing is looking at how we can actually provide training or education so that people can be upskilled to deliver. So cities don't seem, that they might have the aspiration and technologically they may have the thing, but in terms of an urban planning capacity or a economic development capacity, smart is sort of siloed as digital. And of course, then if you don't have a joined up approach, it's very difficult. So one of the things we've been doing in Plymouth is looking at developing a master's program that will hopefully build up capacity for people to deliver smart city projects in a master's sense. So I'll finish there.
Thank you. And now to our final presenters. It's a little bit different from the earlier two papers in that it doesn't focus explicitly on the mission itself. But the sort of common thread running through is the way kind of technology and policy interact and play with each other.
Okay, thanks Neha, and thanks everyone for being here. Our project does in a way I think flow a little bit now that I think about it. It's like the question about what is awareness. I mean the central role that citizens play in sort of in their own future in the building of their cities. So this question of awareness is something that'll feature a bit in our presentation, but it primarily deals with a few specific moments. So we're not going to talk a bit about a big sort of framework. We're kind of presenting a very you can say just we're beginning to do this kind of work. So this project, this paper is an outcome of a kind of a pilot study. So all the conclusions are inconclusive in some ways. So so it's called Online Public Debate and Environmental Policy, Urban Environment Policy, partly because we don't know what the relation is at the moment. So, just to introduce you, in Bangalore, we come from Delhi, one of the most populous urban settlements. We have very different estimates of what the actual size is, but it's also one of the most polluted, and someone has put it very well that pollution is actually a case of environmental injustice. So we need to see the political, social ramifications of that big debate that keeps featuring in our headlines. So it's more than just about air in itself. And the other thing that we really want to talk about today is the nature of politics that is growing around these issues in such a big metropolitan area, is that issues of environmental issues are increasingly subject of politics of a particular variety. The term we use here, partisan trap, is used from Pradap Bhanu Mehta's article on partisan trap being a moment in Indian democracy when the polarizations are so strong, in a sense that they are dysfunction, they're making governance and all other sort of negotiations that make any democracy almost dysfunctional. And I think there's a very nice AIB sketch about everything comes down to whether you're pro or anti somebody. So I think we don't want to use it as a conceptual reference, but just to catch your attention, we've used a tweet from the current incumbent CM, who has tweeted a very graphic image of the kind of impact pollution is having on citizens. But it's also, at another level, an image which shows that the way now these debates are taking place online, where you have a deep politicization, but also kind of personalization. So people higher up in the administration are taking personal responsibility for addressing issues in a very different sort of affective way. So we think this is quite interesting. And there's a lot of work on this elsewhere, like around climate change in the US, for example, where concerns have moved about what does it mean. But at the same time, online is also a place where you have a lot more citizens engaging with this issue. So on the right, there's another tweet from somebody who has used, so this is a funny picture actually. It's like, because the odd even scheme, which we were going to talk about, requires you to have odd numbers on even days and vice versa. But they've kind of shown that how you can bypass that. But the point is that someone's done a study on this and has shown that people's online engagement is deeply implicated in their political affiliation. How they define themselves shapes the way they tweet about things. So this is a recent study which looked at almost 1 million tweets. So it's a very different kind of study. It went as far as saying that partisan affiliation has an impact on your participation. Well, so we want to go a bit beyond this. We want to see what does it mean. So for example, going back to the previous presentation, what is the nature of citizen engagement? What does it mean for the awareness that citizens of Delhi have about their environment and what's being done about? So we want to push in 3 specific questions, which is that, one is that what kind of media is online media? Is it a channel mostly for now polarizing partisan debate and not really, let's say, awareness creating platform, as some people might think of it? What else is going on? I mean, in terms of, is online media, we also want to think of it as a site where, participation gets articulated. So it's also people, yeah, so we'll show some of that in a bit. And also thinking about like whether, if at all, this is the way to end, let's say, the apathy that many complain that citizens of Indian cities have towards environmental issues. So we want to think a bit beyond sort of that. The framework we have comes from 2 specific literatures. One is kind of the classical literature from political economy on how collective action on environmental issues happens, what motivates people, but what we can say about online. And the other is sort of the understanding that online media is going to be this transformative, disruptive way in which citizens have engaged with questions of environment. So I'll let Gaurav talk a bit about what's the model for how we're thinking about online as a new place where people can organize together. And all of this goes beyond sort of the classic information deficit model, which is that people don't know, so we need to run campaigns to inform them about environmental degradation, and that information, if they had more information, they'll perhaps. So that classical model is what we are questioning at the very basis. So yeah, go ahead, Gaurav.
Oh yeah, so one of the strands that Aasim just talked about comes from Elinor Ostrom's governing the commons, very prominent work, wherein she's giving an alternative institutional way of managing common pool resources. Now you could think of air pollution or air quality as a common pool resource, wherein prior to her work there were two dominant institutions debated who could solve the problem, right? So it was either the state-run system wherein the state forms policies, elites told you what to do, and okay, everybody just followed suit. The second one was the private management model. So wherein you create incentives, interests around good management of the common pool resource, and probably that would solve the problem. Well, her observations were that in case of fisheries, in case of managing a park in a community, whenever a government or a private sector entered, well, the resource sort of depleted or deteriorated, which was earlier seemed to be going very well with when the local community self-regulated or organized itself to kind of deliver the goods. And so here we will think of online social media as a medium or a platform wherein you citizens give you a sense of if they are on that platform, given that they are on there, and air pollution is happening, policies are being rolled out. How would they, how exactly are they, organizing themselves in that debate towards solving the problem? Are they talking about the problem itself, or, as Aasim said, the partisan interests? So what is winning in this? How is that self-organization happening, or is this Ostrom's, model kind of even relevant in that reality?
Yeah, I mean, so also just thinking about what is the nature of online hierarchies. So there's a lot of discussion about online media, Twitter, Facebook, changing the way people organize, or people have engaged with governance or questions of changing the structures. But let's see some data, and let's look at the nature of online participation. So one of the things we did was we chose a group that was likely to have some interest in this. So we chose, these are 4 handles, as we call them on Twitter, which we thought were giving regular information about just environment. So they're not really polarizing, they're kind of telling you how bad the air quality might be, or what kind of weather data is available. So these are people who are following these handles. So it's kind of a strategic sampling, and then methods-wise, we also used a range of methods to analyze that data that we collected. It includes content analysis, people's self-descriptions online, as well as their, what they're saying online. In terms of, using some of the more sort of economic models, we also developed a model, and we'll talk about it in a bit. So just to give you an overall picture, what really happened. The blue line is the overall tweets all through that period. So if you remember, I don't think anyone would, but yeah, January 1st to 15th of 2016 is when this sort of odd-even thing came into being. And we looked at the data not just during that, but we also looked at what was happening before that and what happened after that. So if you look at overall, kind of nothing to explain, we don't know what that is, that's a lot of things, but the thin, narrow orange line at the bottom, that's the people that we are looking at, that's their engagement with issues related to odd-even, air pollution. So we created a dictionary of words. I mean, it's a very typical method of how you find what is being talked about. We created a sort of, a stemming approach to collect all the words that were tweeted and find words that were relevant to, let's say, air quality, odd even, but hardly any engagement. So if you look at it, in spite of all the big, is left or left? Oh, wow, okay. So basically there's no real change in their engagement. So there's hardly, and overall we can define that the issue of air pollution was not salient. So we call it issue salience didn't really change before or after. So we all know about it, but in terms of engagement, there's nothing going on. This is a little more zooming into that middle portion. So we looked at people who define themselves as environmentalists or engaged or concerned about environment. So we looked into their Twitter biographies. Around 200 odd people out of the total sample of around 1,400 people. And then we looked at people who identified themselves only as, or clearly as partisans. I mean, they would either say we are, bhakt, or we are kind of tied to this party, and, and you can see their behavior defines that. So we kind of, the greens are the kind of green sort of environmental groups, and the reds are what we can think of them as partisans, but all of them are engaged, are following those 4 handles. So they show some interest in environment. But look at the general pattern of engagement. I mean, by and large, the green has an upper hand. They're also more in number. But the interesting thing is that during that odd-even period, which is the middle period, if you look at in the middle, there is a spike in the red worm as well, like it really goes up. And it's almost matching the green if you normalize the numbers. And before that, there was hardly any interest. And if you see that once that period ends around 10th, 15th, it almost goes back to being zero. So the engagement, right, peters out very quickly. So this idea that, if you know about things, you will be engaged is quite not evident. It looks like it comes as a moment of peak engagement and then it's gone. And some of the analysis of this, what Gaurav would explain, really is revelatory in terms of the impact this kind of scenario has on these people who are green, who are interested. What happens to their participation when they encounter such a polarizing environment? So what we did, we also mapped them as social networks. We also mapped them as a network. So the red dots, nodes are all the partisan people in our group. And the greens on the right are the people who are following or showing interest in environment consistently. The difference, I think, is quite self-evident. On the left, you have a group which is hardly linked to each other. They all look like isolated actors. And if you look at the measures that we come up with, there's hardly any connectivity. While on the right, the environmentalists tend to know each other, tend to follow each other. So the arc between them is whether they follow one another, whether they have any relation. So it's quite densely related. I mean, it's on many times more, the interconnections among people who are environmentalists or environmentally inclined is much higher than the one on the left, which are people with partisan interests. And this really transforms if you throw in what we call the stars. And so on the left is the thing we showed earlier, which is people without their, let's say, the star system. And on the right, we added these big names, the partisan leaders, the political figures who were tweeting actively during this course of this period about this particular issue. And the number of interconnections explode. I mean, you can see now there's hardly anyone left out. So it looks like there is a kind of a star system at work where individuals, partisan members are not really the story. The real story is the way they organize themselves around particular actors. Yeah. And this is what we call is actually going on online. You have a star system. You have a picture where you have two very polarizing figures, let's say during this debate, and almost entirely everyone is, so the size of the dot represents how many people are following them. So it's quite clear. We don't even need to show that the right, which is the right axis, the green axis, is actually where the environmentalists are located. There's hardly a single dot that you can read because there's hardly any figure like who can pull. Gaurav will go in some of more details and what this all means in terms of.
Yeah, so I'm not going to look at you anymore. So, so this is kind of a, positing or even as kind of a quasi-experiment wherein you do a treatment to the Delhiites who are, actually affected on ground. They're not going to be able to, they are facing all the traffic. They are getting into congestions or they are getting all the inconvenience, etc. Whereas the NCR region out around Delhi, which is facing same kind of air pollution, similar air pollution, but is not really treated. But they are both online and they are both engaging. So you kind of model this, and this is a quantitative analysis, but you kind of model it as a difference approach, wherein, and you could just go back a little. Yeah, so wherein just compare the first difference between Delhiites before the policy was rolled out and after the policy was rolled out on green issues. What is their level of engagement, average level of engagement, average number of tweets, okay? Yeah, I would just, we are just left with 2 slides, sorry. Right? So what we find here is that although the number of tweets you saw were going up overall, they were not coming from Delhi. Within Delhi, the treatment actually lowered green engagement, and it was all coming from outside, people who are actually not really affected by the policy, right? And what is worse is that the engagement went down further for environmentally inclined agents or Twitter users compared to the partisan users. So the effect was worse. So in some sense, partisanship now seems like counterproductive to civic engagement around environmental issues or equality. We also, so there is a, keep going. There is a caveat here, this is just a pilot study. Only 10% of people, users in our sample actually tweeted something, right? So there are a lot of zeros. They're not doing anything. So obviously, our estimations are not robust, or you can say they are kind of unstable at the moment, but they give you an idea of what's happening. Okay, so so just to conclude, well, first of all, environmental pollution, air pollution failed to garner any sort of issue salience online, even though there was this heightened interest around the policy, which was quite observed. We find that there is a particular star system in networks wherein these personalities, famous personalities, also potentially polarizing personalities, kind of have very dense network, and they can sway how engagement or discussions happen. We find positive network effects, so that if my peers are tweeting more, I tend to tweet more as well. But adulterate it with with partisanship, and it turns out to be counterproductive towards raising any sort of engagement towards the issue itself. Okay, so that's about it. We welcome your comments, and sorry that we.
So thank you all for holding to time. I'm really sorry to have pushed all of you. So we'll take a couple of rounds of questions, and then I'll just sum up at the end with a few sort of concluding remarks. Do we have mics?
Should I start? Okay. All right. Thank you so much. That was a very interesting presentation. So my question is towards Aasim Khan and Gaurav Arora. Actually, it's 2 or 3 sub-questions. The first thing is, you had mentioned that the original basis for your study was based on Ostrom's work. And I just wanted to clarify, because towards the conclusion, I could not see the connection between the results of your study and whether you went back and revisited the theories of Ostrom that you had talked about earlier in your work. So if you could clarify a little bit on that. And attached to that, I just wanted to add, typically when we are like looking, when I was studying Ostrom's work earlier, I had come across in various different places at least 3 major critiques. The critique of scale, which is that most of Ostrom's case studies concentrate on a fairly small communities of 200 to 300 people each, and when you start scaling it up, many of the principles often don't hold. So the second is that of community, that there often needs to be a strong sense of a homogeneous community where people interact with each other regularly in order to build a commons, which you often don't see in heterogeneous spaces such as cities. And which brings me to my third point on the idea of collective ownership, that in many urban spaces, it's often difficult to find examples of collective ownership, since so much of our cities are owned either by private or by state actors, which often leads to collective action problems in some senses. So I just wanted to know if you went back to Ostrom's theories, and did you engage, and what were your conclusions regarding that? Thank you.
We'll just take a few and then respond.
Very interesting panel. Thanks. My question was for Katharine. You were talking about a lack of citizen engagement. You observed a lack of citizen engagement in the Chennai case, and I'm assuming it's in the government forums, where public forums, where they were inviting participation or conversations. Based on your other experiences from England and the other countries that you've been to, would you have some? Would you kind of compare how your experience there was, what your observations were?
This is a comment on the issue of participation. I think Katharine and Uttara, both of you discussed about. So I just want you to highlight on if what kind of vision of participation you are looking at. Like, participation is primarily as elicited in the documents. From the policy document, it is just government induced kind of participation. But participation, if you look at on in a wider kind of framing, then it comes out to be in very, very interesting ways. Like, so even the citizens doing something, like people coming on the streets, or citizen meddling with the technologies, or doing some kind of so basically the technology failures occurring due to some counters by the citizens and all. So basically, to incorporate in the vision of participation what city does to technology and infrastructure, and not only what infrastructure and technology does to the city, which is what Saskia Sasin also talks about, that that city talks back and city hacks the technology in some sense. Thank you.
Take one more and then let the panelists respond.
Aasim and Gaurav, it sort of takes off from his comment. Do you think sort of understanding civic engagement through the lens of social media or Twitter or whatever, do you think it can sort of be limiting because it doesn't understand how communities and systems react to these changes instead of just individuals online?
So I think, yeah, just to go back to the first set of concerns, so I'll answer only the bit where, I think this method as the challenges of doing it. And I think in some ways we are pushing two boundaries. One is on the side of methods, so what is online media? We, for example, don't think of Twitter or, these as social networks per se. I mean, there's a lot of data on what kind of hierarchies do exist within them. So can we call them network? And nor are we trying to see them as mirrors of society where people are acting the way they would on ground. So both are very, very clear. In fact, that caveat in the end, in fact, was to just to flag up that we don't think we have the conclusive answer to even this kind of question, even at the methods level. Whether scales and all of that, I mean, that's a different kind of concern that I think follows from that once you have, so for example, think about it as a media which is related to the ongoing talk on ground. So I think one of the ways we're trying to think of Twitter is that it extends that talk in other spaces and links beyond, let's say, geographical boundaries. I think yesterday there was a panel on that. So it's not that it's cut off or it's reflecting something on ground. It's actually maybe a continuation in many ways, and it comes back to recreating some of the biases online. So we are still trying to look at it, but in terms of the problem, we see that it's relevant to look at it. So we are very clear that yes, you have these discussions. They're quite clearly reflective of some kind of change that's happening. Vis-a-vis the specific question of the theories of collective action and common pool resources, I think India in general would be a good place to begin to look into a little more empirical data and to see what is the nature of communities that come through such dense networks that exist in our urban culture today. So we are bringing in media because it does capture a little bit of that. So it's a kind of methodological boundary pushing as well as kind of theoretical. So we're not just asking back, we're not just using the theory and seeing whether it speaks to us. It's also, we know where this theory comes from and what the key concerns were. So it came at a particular time in a particular place in US. We are in a particular time it's technologically, you can say it permeates everything, so why not? So I'll let Gaurav talk a little bit about the model itself.
Yeah, so I mean, the way I see this, and this goes back to both of you saying that you said, okay, you got some results. Did you go back and check? Is this even in agreement with the mechanics of Ostrom's entire, the model that she put forth? Well, for that particular exercise, you would have to think of Twitter, and at least as I think of Twitter as a platform, wherein now you are there. Okay, so it's given that you have joined in. Okay, and to kind of empirically base it, who is on Twitter? Less than probably 1% of Delhi would be on Twitter, and we know the kind of privilege it takes to be on Twitter and to be, so I don't know if that is, it reflects to begin with the kind of heterogeneity that the city has. So to answer To come back to his question, does it reflect the society? No. It's a clear answer I have, right? So, and that's a question for ourselves in this project. Where do we go from here, right? But it does give you a sense, given that now you are on this platform, you are affected by this common pool resource problem, which is air pollution. Every minuscule actor is acting in a way that pollution has gone up to the level it has, and they have been intervened through a policy. Now you are organizing yourself to talk about it. So it gives you a platform to just reflect on how they organized and what they did, right? So only to that extent, yes, we can think about it. But then taking it back to, informing policy, going to, we'll say just stop there. We'll think about it. We'll have to think about it a little more. Okay, that's my answer.
Yeah, so in terms of looking at projects which do effectively implement smart city projects that do involve citizens in a positive way, I think if we look at and it's not just the Indian smart cities case. There's a lot of smart city projects which are top-down and tokenistic, so there is no capacity for people. Where it works is where you start with a city and you start with often a smaller scale space or a capacity that already exists within that community or that area of this, or even a capacity in terms of a technical capacity. And you look at then how the next stage is so you take into account capacity and history and the context, the space itself. So some of the cities, they start possibly with a local community stakeholder or and then the partnerships, there's a lot around co-design. So you start with not the answer, not the solution, you start with the problem or possibly a capacity, and then you look at what actually might work or what you might want to address within that city. So there's a much more interrogative and co-design approach, and that, so for example, some of the Scandinavian cities have been quite good at this, and also Amsterdam and Barcelona. They've started with working at a district scale, but much more sensitively with local stakeholders. First of all, identifying how they might work together, co-designing, and then prototyping in various aspects. So, for example, with pollution sensing, rather than going, we're going to implement a citywide model where we control the data and we let you know, it's based on open data, so no private platforms, completely open systems. So I'm quite interested by the Sasson comment. Sasson talks about this idea of open source urbanism, and I think that's very much this, how can you make an open source urbanism, not a top-down controlled. They then give capacity and possibly upskilling with the population and look at issues which are relevant to them and then try and work with that. So, and then it's low cost and not necessarily low maintenance, but at least the maintenance is doable at a local scale. So it's not a proprietary system which is lock-in and you can't access. So you provide small-scale, low-cost sensors and distribute them among population and let them gather the data and then decide what they want to do with it. All that sort of, that's not that. I mean, if you come from urban design or an urban planning background, that's how you deliver successful projects. It's nothing to do with smart city. It's if you want to you need to involve people before you've decided what you're going to do. So essentially these large, very high-profile projects which tell you the solution and say, do you agree? Well, okay, fine, but it's not going to work. So starting with participation as a core is actually not a sort of lip service to governance. Is actually the only way to deliver these sort of large-scale projects. You need to get buy-in and to build capacity within the population. And through groups, not necessarily through individuals. If you go out to individuals, you're always going to fail because individuals might have capacity. Work with existing groups who have capacity and build up through that. I don't know if that answers your question, but it sort of links into this. I mean, I think Sasson's idea of the city talking back, and it's very much around this right to the city and the city itself having a voice rather than this idea of just citizens. So what works for a city?
I'm just going to address the question of the vision of participation, which it's a complex question, definitely, but I think it, like Katharine just said, that it's not about post facto participation of like bringing voting in. Reducing participation in democracy to vote. So either if it's periodical elections or voting on particular policy through various apps and websites, but without a deep understanding of what that means, that's not participation, that's voting, and those are not the same things. I think that in terms of a vision of participation, the entire process has to be inclusive, has to be bottom up. And it's not, I mean, these are not merely idealistic utopian ideas. There are enough examples of large-scale amounts of participation. I mean, the Indian government also has, even within the 74th Amendment, has succeeded much more in terms of empowering the Panchayati Raj system. I'm not saying that it is without problem, but it is definitely a more empowered body than urban local bodies, where within cities we are more concerned with central and state level elections. We're not as concerned with how our own city governments work, who our commissioners are, what they do, what the extent of their powers are. So I think participation in the entire process, rather than saying, okay, we have this smart city mission, what do you think about it? What do you think about having Wi-Fi at train stations? I mean, those make participation very facile questions. So, yeah.
Should we take one more round?
I think this is a question for all the panelists, because there's a very very strategic strand going on. And I was wondering how, about something Katharine said, and then that would sort of be addressed to Aasim and Gaurav's thing about how to understand the, smartness is not a kind of smartness as it is set out in the guidelines. So those more sort of tacile tactics, smartnesses, and which are already existing, and this sort of whole idea of open source urbanism, it already happens. It already is sort of it's already there, because in terms of spaces, communities, people on the margins, at different levels, negotiate with the city, right? So that's already there. So within what you guys are proposing with this sort of methodological interventions, looking at a very sort of, standard mainstream platform like Twitter, what would you say that kind of smartness, which is not captured within the imagination of the mission or not acknowledged, can be tapped into? Is there?
Yeah, hi, my question is to Willis. I was just a bit confused about the timeline of the mission and where, especially with the component of the street vendors, especially because I remember in 2014 or 15, the Pondi Bazaar leg of T Nagar, I mean the street vendors, they were already evicted as part of a different plan, like a T Nagar redevelopment plan, and then there was also a mention of decongesting T Nagar as part of the master plan. So there's also other missions and plans which talk about this, and especially it's interesting because Pondicherry, Pondi Bazaar, which is like a pedestrian pathway, is much less congested than like the retail giants section of T Nagar. So I mean, all of that was kind of missing in your presentation, and I was interested about that.
Okay, yeah, I mean, this is exactly the point. I mean, to just go back a little bit, I mean, also that, things are being done. Things are not only there, they're also being done through these discussion-based understanding of what people want, which may not, it's not, it was never intended, but they take into account that this is the case. So one way I think this can be done is that we need to look for more talk elsewhere, and the way it already happens. So, the fact that, IT and, digital is making it much more accessible to us as researchers need not make it like this is the only way to do research. In fact, that is a big trap we might fall into, because the data is just so easy to collect. I mean, not easy, but there are now defined ways in which we can collect talk online. How do we do it in terms of like elsewhere is definitely the way to go. In fact, that's what we are now thinking of doing. Just to go back a little bit, I mean, the one thing we want to puncture a little bit is this idea of like people don't know or that information is not there. Actually, there's a lot of information. It's inevitably going to be implicated in the socio-political structures. And information is equally valuable for those elites as well. And they will be in the game of, I mean, there's a fascinating projects going on in the Western world about computational propaganda, about use of bots online. We don't think we have reached that stage, but at the same time, with the expansive reach of WhatsApp and whatnot, you have no way now that you can avoid these platforms as well. So I think we really need to push ourselves also as researchers to think beyond it. And at a more theoretical level, we need to think about talk as institutions. So institutions are not just made in paper or what's written on government policy, but talk itself is a kind of an institution. And deliberative switch is something we all need to make maybe in a study of policy.
Yeah, so I think I'm just going to try and address both points, but mainly the second one is I did try to acknowledge that the Smart City mission in Chennai was essentially a rebranding of an existing project. So I think this is, so rather than the sort of historicality of that, I think that the main output from that was we can take a governmental idea of what smart is and understand whether we want it or not, or you can push back and try and reclaim smartness. And so what we found with the street vendors is like they're probably being quite smart in the way that they work. They use mobile technologies very cleverly, but that would never be acknowledged. So, and there was a second round for them to be evicted. So that was, I don't know whether the push and pull of various political things, but there's a need for a much more bottom-up, or a mixture of bottom-up and top-down, where we reclaim smart with what it is and how we actually use it and how we are clever with technology and use it in the way which benefits the city. So using things like, whether we like Uber as a thing, but crowdsourcing or those sorts of techniques are very, very clever and local and reorganize the city. But if they're not acknowledged as part of what the city is, then what we have is a definition of smart, which is just a branding of some sort of urban development program. I think the key thing we've understood from looking at a lot of smart city projects globally is smart is whatever it wants to be. There is no smart. So smart is innovation, it's sustainability, so there's a need to reclaim some of this language and some of these, what participation means, and if participation is only us listening to what is being told to us and deciding whether we want it or not, that's, so there's actually there's a need to build capacity. I think that's what I meant about awareness raising, from awareness raising to technical capacity to community-led capacity or governmental capacity to use technology for our societal benefit in an urban sense. And that's this sort of open source urbanism and what Aasim might talk about. But unless we, and particularly among, say, architects, urban designers, urban planners, or those working in those spaces, the need to engage with it and sort of recognise that these projects probably are going to start coming out and we don't actually engage with them, fully, then things will happen which aren't necessarily what we would hope to happen in the city. Our vision will be, told to us by others. So I think that was my thought.
So I'm just going to, we have about 5 or 10 minutes left. I'm just going to take that time to wrap up and kind of try and see if we can pull a few threads together from across the different papers that we presented today. So I think that it was actually really interesting what we saw reflected in the panel today also, not only in terms of kind of the conversation that went back and forth between sort of questions of participation, questions of access, and the sort of questions of knowledge and information dissemination and generation, but also a sort of scalar question in some senses. So talking about the mission as a whole as somewhat of an umbrella policy almost, and then talking of sort of specific applications within the case of Chennai and sort of the specifics of participation in that case, or in the case of the use and access to kind of so influencing policy in some ways through various online communities and fora. In this case, Twitter, in the particular case of Delhi. And I think I would like to sort of push all of us to think a little bit more about sort of what this means, to sort of echo what was being said even through comments that came from the audience, is sort of the connection between this one. I mean, this is kind of, it seems to be almost sort of dominating policy discourse in some ways when we talk about technology, and I think that was part of the sort of motivation for this, the theme of this conference as well, is to think and to push ourselves to think a little bit beyond smart cities and beyond just digital technologies when we think about infrastructure and we think about technology itself. And so a lot of the sort of concerns we're hearing today also have echoes in sort of historically in previous iterations of any kind of new wave of change in some way in terms of technology, in terms of infrastructure development, and also to think of who it is that makes these things possible. So whether it's sort of at the individual scale as we think through Twitter and WhatsApp and Facebook, or is there some sort of connection across various other institutional actors, whether it's the state or private corporations or RWAs, and so to think about sort of what actors and what groups are being facilitated through these various kind of emerging technologies and emerging forms that we're beginning to see, and how much of this participation and presence and role of each of these players is being facilitated. The other thing I'd also like to kind of put on the table is this idea of using sort of emerging infrastructure and emerging technologies as sort of fixes. And I think that's something that we see across not just through sort of the smart city mission, which seems to be the most recent sort of iteration of this, but thinking about kind of large infrastructure. I mean, if you just sort of step outside, the sort of magic box underpass that you see over there is one example of a quick technological fix. And that the government of Karnataka spent crores on trying to sort of just avoid putting up a traffic light at that junction. And if you go by there now, there is actually a traffic light. After about 15 years of thinking through what a technological fix would sort of help sort of ease the congestion over there. So it's from sort of small examples like that to thinking all the way back to sort of how one uses whatever emerging technology, whether it is sort of creating a new kind of underpass or online, communities and platforms, and how one can use that to enable different sorts of interventions, whether sort of empowering transformation or to sort of, increase kind of ease of access and information across policy. And the other thing, the final thing I'd like to kind of close with is sort of the importance of knowledge and the importance of language and terminology that we've been using, because as the panelists have kind of echoed repeatedly, it's the idea of sort of smartness doesn't really it seems to be this ephemeral term almost that's floating somewhere, and that's kind of being sort of pulled down and used and applied in different policy documents in different geographical and spatial contexts. By different groups of people, and it almost seems to have lost the kind of initial sort of impetus that came from an IBM or a Siemens to market it as a product, and has gone way beyond that sort of almost narrow application. And so to think a little bit about sort of the terms and terminology that we use to describe these things, and to be very careful about how we use them. And so I think on that note, I'd like to kind of close and thank you all very much for coming. This is also the last session of Urban Arc, and so again, thank you all for being here through the 3 days, and we hope to see you again next year. Thanks.